Caleb Voss was a name no one in Minnesota knew until the night he turned a small-town fair into a scene of horror, vanishing into the darkness and leaving behind 12 dead, dozens wounded, and an entire state gripped by fear. On a quiet spring night in Minnesota, families gathered at the town's annual fair. The air was filled with the smell of fried food, the sound of children laughing, and music playing from a small stage where a local band performed. People strolled between brightly lit booths carrying stuffed animals won at games and plates piled high with food. It was the kind of night that felt safe and ordinary, the sort of event where nothing bad was expected to happen. That sense of comfort lasted until the first sharp crack of gunfire cut through the music. At first, many thought the sound was part of the entertainment. Some believed it was fireworks, but when the second and third shots came in rapid succession, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Screams rose instantly, shattering the calm atmosphere as the crowd surged toward exits. In the chaos, tables were overturned, children were separated from their parents, and shoes, bags, and phones were left scattered across the fairgrounds. Witnesses later recalled a figure moving quickly near the edge of the field, slipping between shadows and targeting the crowd with terrifying precision. Panic spread faster than the sound of the shots. People sprinted toward parked cars, some diving under vehicles for cover, while others collapsed to the ground in hopes of avoiding the bullets. The shooter fired in bursts, forcing hundreds of people into a frenzy of fear. A food stall caught fire when a propane tank tipped over, sending smoke into the night sky and adding to the confusion. Emergency calls flooded dispatch lines within seconds, with frantic voices begging for help, each one describing scenes more horrific than the last. By the time the first police units arrived, the scene resembled a war zone. Bodies lay motionless on the ground while injured victims cried out for help. Officers rushed to secure the area, unsure if the gunman was still present or hiding nearby. They found shell casings scattered across the pavement, evidence of a high-powered rifle being used with deadly efficiency, but the shooter himself had vanished. The fairgrounds, once glowing with lights and music, were now eerily silent except for the sobs of survivors and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Paramedics worked frantically, moving from victim to victim under the harsh glare of emergency lights. Some lives were saved, but many could not be reached in time. In just minutes, 12 people were dead and dozens more were wounded. The killer had struck without warning and disappeared without leaving a clear trail. Investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with someone who knew how to move unseen and vanish before law enforcement could react. News of the massacre spread before dawn. Television screens across the state replayed the same horrifying images: abandoned strollers, blood stains on the pavement, and terrified survivors describing the nightmare. The fairground that had once symbolized community now stood as a reminder of how fragile safety could be. In a single night, Minnesota had changed forever. And somewhere out there, the gunman was still free. In the days that followed, investigators were met with frustration at every turn. The sheer chaos of the attack had left behind an overwhelming amount of evidence, yet none of it seemed to point in a clear direction. Witness statements conflicted wildly, with some describing the shooter as tall and broad-shouldered, while others insisted he was slim and shorter than average. The dim lighting at the fairground and the panic of the moment had blurred memories, leaving police unable to build a reliable profile. Surveillance cameras that had been set up for security captured little more than streaks of movement and flashes of gunfire. Every frame was too dark, too grainy, and too fast to provide answers. The weapon used gave investigators some information, but not enough. Shell casings collected at the scene indicated a military-style rifle, but the gun itself was nowhere to be found. Without it, tracing the origin of the weapon became nearly impossible. Gun shops across the state were checked for suspicious purchases, but no unusual transactions stood out. It was as though the killer had planned the attack to leave behind only fragments of clues, each one leading nowhere. Detectives combed through local criminal records, searching for individuals with histories of violence or weapons charges, yet none matched the emerging picture of someone who could pull off such a devastating assault. As the investigation faltered, fear took root in the community. Families who had once felt safe attending public events now stayed home, avoiding crowds and gatherings. The sound of fireworks, once a symbol of celebration, now sent people ducking for cover. News outlets ran constant updates, filling airtime with speculation and expert opinions, but with no solid leads, the coverage only deepened the sense of dread. Rumors flourished on social media, with some insisting the attack was the work of a terrorist group, while others believed it was a lone wolf living among them. The absence of answers gave the shooter an almost mythical presence, a faceless figure whose silence spoke louder than words. Pressure mounted on law enforcement as criticism poured in from every direction. Families of victims demanded swift justice, politicians called for stronger security measures, and the public accused the police of incompetence. Investigators, however, were working around the clock, poring over every scrap of evidence in hopes of catching a break. Teams analyzed cell tower records from the night of the shooting, looking for unusual patterns, but the sheer number of devices at the fair made it nearly impossible to separate the ordinary from the suspicious. Each promising lead turned cold after days of digging, leaving detectives back at the beginning. Weeks turned into a month, and the lack of progress began to erode confidence in the investigation. Officers admitted privately that they were chasing shadows. The shooter had managed to slip into a crowded event, unleash chaos, and disappear as though swallowed by the night. It was a kind of vanishing act that defied explanation, one that made even seasoned investigators question whether they were up against something far more dangerous than they had first imagined. In the absence of a suspect, the massacre became not just a crime, but a mystery that consumed the entire state. The investigation seemed trapped in a cycle of false starts until an unexpected tip shifted the focus. In the northern Minnesota woods, a hunter exploring a remote trail stumbled across a half-buried duffel bag hidden beneath branches and leaves. Inside, he found empty ammunition boxes, mud-caked boots, and a crumpled parking ticket from a small town nearly 200 miles away from the massacre site. Recognizing the possible connection to the fairground shooting, he contacted authorities, and within hours the items were in the hands of forensic teams. The bag quickly became the first solid lead. The boots were sent to a lab where experts examined soil and plant matter stuck to the soles. They determined the mud was not from the fairgrounds but from a swampy area closer to where the hunter had been walking, suggesting the killer had been hiding in the wilderness after the attack. The empty ammunition boxes, all of the same caliber used at the fairground, tied the discovery directly to the massacre. Yet the most promising clue was the faded parking ticket. Printed with a time and date, it led investigators to a town that had not been on their radar. Detectives combed through surveillance footage from that town's bus depot, the location where the ticket had been issued. At first, the hours of video yielded nothing unusual, just commuters and travelers moving in and out. Then, a grainy image appeared, a man leaving an old sedan and walking briskly toward the station. His face was partly hidden beneath a hood, but his build and movements suggested military training, deliberate, controlled, and cautious. The car he left behind had been abandoned, and when police traced its registration, they found it had been stolen weeks earlier from a nearby city. The abandoned sedan became a treasure trove of information. Inside, fingerprints were lifted from the steering wheel, door handles, and rearview mirror. Analysts worked quickly, and within days they had a name, Caleb Voss. Records revealed that Voss was a 35-year-old former soldier with a checkered past. After serving overseas, he had struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Reports of violent outbursts and altercations surfaced during his time at a halfway house, though none had led to serious charges. He had no steady job, no close family ties, and lived mostly off the grid. The more investigators uncovered about Voss, the more he seemed to fit the profile of the killer. His military background explained his ability to move unseen and handle weapons with deadly efficiency. His history of instability painted a picture of someone capable of lashing out in catastrophic ways. Still, there was no direct evidence linking him to the massacre beyond circumstantial connections. Authorities debated whether to go public with his name, fearing it might drive him deeper into hiding, but the urgency of the case outweighed the risk. Quietly, a manhunt began, with federal agencies joining state police to track every trace of Caleb Voss. For the first time since the night of the massacre, investigators felt they were no longer chasing a ghost. They had a name, a face, and a history. What they did not yet realize was that Voss had been watching them too, carefully studying their every move and preparing his next strike. Locating Caleb Voss proved far more difficult than investigators expected. The initial assumption had been that he was simply a fugitive running from capture, but it quickly became clear he was operating with a calculated strategy. Each time law enforcement closed in on one of his hideouts, another shooting erupted elsewhere in the state. A quiet diner on the outskirts of Duluth, a roadside gas station in Brainerd, even a rural church hosting a late-night service, each site was struck with terrifying precision. The shootings had no clear link to one another, yet they all carried the same signature: swift execution, multiple victims, and an escape without a trace. Voss was using violence not just as survival, but as a weapon of control, pulling police in every direction while he remained one step ahead. Detectives soon realized they were being manipulated. He seemed to anticipate police movements, abandoning safe houses hours before raids, ditching vehicles just before they were discovered, and vanishing from areas moments before surveillance teams arrived. It was as if he could read their plans in advance. Investigators began to suspect he had access to police radio chatter or inside knowledge of their tactics, though nothing could be proven. His behavior transformed the manhunt into a deadly game of cat and mouse, one where the cat was constantly being outmaneuvered. The psychological toll grew heavier with every week. Officers working the case described a creeping paranoia, the sense that Voss was not only escaping them but watching them closely. In several instances, law enforcement personnel received anonymous packages at their precincts. Inside were newspaper clippings about the massacre marked with handwritten notes. Some included crude sketches of rifles, others simply contained dates and times that corresponded eerily with upcoming community events. Whether or not Voss had planted them himself, the messages heightened the fear that he was orchestrating his attacks with chilling foresight. Public fear reached new levels. Towns canceled festivals, schools held emergency drills, and businesses shortened hours to reduce the risk of being targeted. Minnesota, once defined by its quiet landscapes and close-knit communities, became gripped by anxiety. Anyone walking into a crowded place carried the silent thought that they might not walk out. The media dubbed Voss the Phantom Shooter, a title that only seemed to fuel the legends surrounding him. For the families of victims, however, he was no myth but a relentless predator who turned ordinary life into a battlefield. Despite the chaos, investigators pressed on. Behavioral analysts built a profile suggesting that Voss thrived on control and fear, using each attack as a demonstration of power. They believed he carefully studied law enforcement response times, testing their patterns and exploiting their weaknesses. Forensic teams scoured new crime scenes, searching for overlooked mistakes, but Voss continued to cover his tracks. Only small traces: an abandoned jacket, a discarded cigarette, muddy footprints remained behind, and none provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. As weeks turned into months, the sense of urgency deepened. Authorities feared that if he was not caught soon, Voss would escalate even further, perhaps targeting a school or government building. The hunt was no longer just about solving a crime. It had become a battle against a man who viewed the entire state as his personal war zone, a place where he controlled the rules and dictated the fear. For those chasing him, failure was no longer an option because every misstep meant more innocent lives lost. The turning point in the hunt for Caleb Voss came not from a crime scene or a witness, but from a digital trail he never intended to leave behind. Analysts working through mountains of data discovered that, despite his efforts to stay off the grid, Voss had a habit of connecting to unsecured Wi-Fi networks in remote towns. He used these brief sessions to check news articles about himself, reading updates on the manhunt that portrayed him as untouchable. The connections were short, often only minutes long, but they were enough to leave behind faint traces. For months, those traces had gone unnoticed, buried among millions of digital signals. When they were finally pieced together, a pattern began to emerge. The breakthrough came when one of these connections was logged near a quiet lakeside community. Unlike his previous locations, this one was isolated, surrounded by thick woods and few permanent residents. Investigators believed he might be staying in a cabin, using the seclusion to regroup between attacks. The discovery electrified the task force. For the first time, they had a chance to corner him before another massacre unfolded. Every step of the operation was planned with precision, knowing that Voss had slipped away so many times before. Before dawn, a heavily armed team was deployed. They moved silently through the woods, guided only by night vision equipment and the faint glow of the cabin's windows. The air was heavy with tension, every snap of a twig raising the fear that Voss might sense their approach. When the officers surrounded the cabin, they braced for a violent standoff. But inside, the scene was far different from what they expected. Voss was asleep on a cot, his rifle resting within arm's reach, a half-eaten meal still on the table beside him. The entry was swift and overwhelming. Flash grenades shattered the silence, and within seconds officers were on him. Voss woke in confusion, reaching for the weapon, but was pinned before he could raise it. For a man who had eluded them for months and orchestrated a reign of fear across the state, his capture ended in a moment that felt almost anticlimactic. The cabin, stripped of electricity and filled with only basic supplies, showed how he had been living in near isolation. Maps marked with circles and notes revealed his meticulous planning, proof that every attack had been designed to stretch law enforcement thin. When news of the arrest broke, relief spread across Minnesota. Families who had avoided gatherings began to return to normal routines, though the scars of what had happened remained. Vigils were held for the victims, and in towns once shadowed by dread, people spoke cautiously of healing. Yet within law enforcement, the mood was more complicated. Though the manhunt was over, investigators admitted that the case had shaken them deeply. Voss had not been a faceless monster, but a man who used skill, patience, and fear as his weapons. He had turned the state into his battlefield, and for months he dictated the pace of the fight. The capture marked the end of his terror, but the questions he left behind lingered. How many opportunities to stop him had been missed? How many warning signs had gone unnoticed in his past? And, perhaps most haunting of all, could someone like him emerge again? Minnesota was safer with Caleb Voss behind bars, yet the memory of what he had done would never be forgotten.